Eleanor Carter pressed both hands against the chest of a man she had met only twice in her life, and pushed hard, counting under her breath, while blood soaked through her dress and the August sun burned the back of her neck. He wasn't breathing. The mountain cowboy who had turned her away 3 days ago was dying in the dirt in front of her, and Eleanor refused to let that happen. She didn't know why she stayed. She only knew that if Caleb Wyatt died today, something in her would die with him. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow every part until the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The town of Greystone Peak sat at the edge of the Colorado Rockies, high enough that summer clouds sometimes drifted between the pine trees like smoke. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and most people believed that meant they had the right to know everyone's business. Caleb Wyatt was the exception. He had lived on his mountain ranch for 15 years, and in that time, the town had built an entire mythology around the man without ever truly knowing him. They said he'd been broken by a woman. They said he'd once fought off 3 armed men with nothing but a fence post. They said he talked to his horses more than he talked to people, and that the horses probably got the better end of that arrangement. What they didn't say, because most of them didn't notice, was that Caleb Wyatt left supplies outside the doors of struggling families in the dead of night. That he repaired old widow Hattie Moss's roof every spring without being asked. That every orphaned animal within 10 miles of his land seemed to find its way to his barn and never left hungry. Nobody talked about those things. They only talked about his silence. Eleanor Carter had heard all of it before she ever set foot in Greystone Peak. She arrived on a Thursday morning in late June with 2 trunks, a box of sewing supplies, and a bill of sale for the small property her father had left her when he died, a piece of land with a modest house, a dry goods store attached to the front, and a debt to the Greystone Peak Savings Bank that Eleanor had not known existed until the attorney handed her the paperwork. How much? She asked the attorney, a thin man named Briggs who wore his collar too tight. $1,400. Briggs said, not quite meeting her eyes. Due in full by October 1st. Eleanor sat very still. That's 4 months, she said. Yes, ma'am. My father's store earns perhaps $30 a month in a good season. Briggs cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. That is correct. Eleanor looked out the window of his office at the main street of Greystone Peak. A woman in a blue dress crossed the road. A man argued with a mule. A dog slept in the dust outside the general store. Who holds the note? She asked. Briggs hesitated just long enough for Eleanor to know the answer before he said it. Mr. Victor Caldwell. Victor Caldwell was not a difficult man to find. He owned half the town, the mill, the stockyard, 3 of the 4 saloons, and the largest ranch in the valley. He was 55 years old, built like a man who had once been physically powerful and had since decided that money could do all the heavy lifting for him. He had small gray eyes that never stayed warm for long, and he smiled the way some men smile, not because something was funny, but because he'd decided smiling was the most efficient way to communicate that he had already won. He received Eleanor in the parlor of his house, which was large enough to contain Eleanor's entire inherited property twice over. He offered her tea. He asked about her journey. He expressed what sounded almost like sympathy about her father's passing. Then he leaned forward and made his offer. $3,000 for the land, he said. Cash. Debt cleared. Enough left over for you to start fresh somewhere more suitable. Eleanor set down her teacup. More suitable, she repeated. Caldwell spread his hands. A single woman alone in the mountains. It's a hard life. I'm offering you an easy one. You're offering me an exit, Eleanor said. I'm offering you a future. On my father's land. Caldwell's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes shifted. Your father understood the reality of this valley, Miss Carter. He borrowed against that land because he had no other choice. I gave him that option. Now I'm giving you one. Eleanor stood up. I'll consider your offer, she said. Thank you for the tea. She walked out of Victor Caldwell's parlor and did not look back, and she spent the entire wagon ride back to her property, telling herself that the tightness in her chest was anger and not fear. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. The fear was very real. Tia, the land that connected Eleanor's property to the rest of the valley, ran along a creek called Bitter Pine Creek, and on the other side of that creek sat the western boundary of Caleb Wyatt's ranch. Eleanor discovered this on her second day in Greystone Peak, when she walked the full perimeter of her father's land, and stood at the creek bank and looked across at a fence line that stretched as far as she could see in either direction. A man was repairing that fence. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that disappears when a man takes off his hat. He had dark hair and a dark beard and the kind of build that came from 15 years of physical labor in high altitude. And he was working with the focused economical efficiency of a man who had done this exact task so many times that his body could do it without asking his mind for permission. He noticed her before she said anything. He stopped working and looked at her across the creek. He did not tip his hat. He did not smile. He simply looked at her with dark eyes that gave away nothing. "You're Eleanor Carter," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "And you're Caleb Wyatt." "I am?" He went back to his fence. Eleanor watched him work for a moment. Then she said, "I need to ask you something." "Most people do," he said without looking up. She told him about Caldwell, about the debt, about the land, about what Caldwell's ownership of her property would mean for the valley, because she had already figured it out even before she came to the creek. If Caldwell owned her land, he controlled the water access from Bitter Pine Creek to the eastern pastures, which meant he controlled the grazing rights for half the ranchers in the valley, which meant he controlled the ranchers. Caleb listened without interrupting. His hammer kept moving steady as a clock. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that Eleanor thought he hadn't heard her. Then he said, "What do you want from me?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "There's a legal mechanism. If a woman is married, her property cannot be seized for a spouse's prior debt under Colorado territorial law. I checked." Caleb's hammer stopped. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time. "You're asking me to marry you," he said. "I'm asking you to help me keep what's mine," Eleanor said. "And in doing so, protect your own water access. If Caldwell controls the creek boundary, your horses won't drink from it by next spring." Caleb set his hammer down on the fence post. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. "I don't know you," he said. "No." She agreed. "You don't." "I don't want a wife. I don't want a husband," Eleanor said. "I want a legal arrangement that protects two pieces of land from a man who shouldn't own either of them." Caleb picked up his hammer again. "No," he said, and he went back to his fence, and Eleanor walked back to her property, and that was the end of the first conversation. Chand. 3 days later, Caleb Wyatt was dying in the dirt on the south side of his property, and Eleanor Carter was the only person close enough to do anything about it. She had not gone looking for him. She had gone to walk the creek bank again, trying to think through her options. There were other men in the valley she could approach, other legal avenues she hadn't fully explored, a letter she could write to the territorial office in Denver when she heard the horse scream. Not the normal protest of an irritated animal, a genuine terrified scream. Eleanor ran toward the sound without deciding to run. She came over the low ridge and saw the horse first, a big gray stallion with a broken bridle rearing and stamping eyes white with panic. And then she saw the man on the ground near the fence, not moving, one leg twisted at an angle that told her immediately what had happened. The horse had come down on him. Caleb Wyatt lay face up in the dirt, and even from 20 yards away, Eleanor could see the blood. She reached him in seconds she couldn't account for later. His face was gray. His breathing was wrong, shallow, and stuttering with long gaps between each exhale that made her stomach drop. She put her hands on his chest and felt his heart present but faint, the way a candle flame goes just before it goes out entirely. "Caleb," she said. "Caleb, look at me." Nothing. She did what her mother had taught her to do in the seconds before panic became useful. She breathed out, assessed, and acted. His airway first. She tilted his head back carefully, checked his mouth, found nothing blocking it. His breathing improved slightly, not enough, but slightly. She put pressure on the wound at his side, which was bleeding steadily from where he'd come down against the fence post. She used the fabric of her apron, tying it tight enough to slow the flow. Then she stood up and screamed for help with everything she had. Two of Caleb's ranch hands, a young man named Pete and an older one called Stokes, came running from the direction of the barn. They stopped when they saw the scene, and for a terrible 2-second moment, Eleanor watched the shock on their faces and thought, they're going to freeze. "Stokes," she said in a voice she didn't know she had. "Get the wagon. Pete, I need you to hold this cloth exactly where my hands are. Do not move it. Do not let go. Can you do that?" Pete nodded and dropped to his knees. She guided his hands. He held. "Get Dr. Hale," she told Stokes as he ran. "And if Hale isn't in town, get whoever is." It took 4 hours. Dr. Hale was 71 years old and had practiced medicine in the Colorado mountains since before Colorado was a state. He arrived at Caleb's ranch house with a bag that weighed more than most saddles and a disposition that Eleanor would have described as somewhere between gravely serious and implacably calm. He worked on Caleb for 2 hours while Eleanor waited in the main room, which he spent productively by cleaning the kitchen that clearly hadn't been touched in weeks and trying not to think about the way Caleb's breathing had sounded. Finally, Dr. Hale came out. "He'll live," the doctor said, "if nothing goes wrong overnight." Eleanor felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "What went wrong?" she asked. Horse came down on his left side. 3 ribs broken, 1 badly. Significant blood loss from the fence impact. He was lucky the angle wasn't worse. Hale looked at her with the assessing gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime reading situations. "You probably saved him. What you did before the hands reached him." Eleanor didn't say anything. "You family?" Hale asked. "No," Eleanor said. Hale raised an eyebrow and waited. "Neighbor," she said. She stayed anyway. She told herself practical reasons. Pete was barely 20, and Stokes had a family in town he needed to get back to, and someone needed to be present through the night in case Caleb's condition changed. Those were all true things. She chose not to examine why those true things felt like a cover story for something she wasn't ready to name. Caleb regained consciousness near midnight. Eleanor was sitting in the chair beside the bed, reading or pretending to read a 3-month-old copy of the Denver newspaper she'd found on his kitchen table. She heard the change in his breathing before she saw his eyes open, and she set the paper down and leaned forward. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough, scraped raw. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because someone needed to be." Caleb looked at her for a long time. His expression was hard to read. Pain complicated things, and so did whatever Caleb Wyatt normally kept behind his eyes. But something shifted. "You're the Carter woman," he said finally. "Who asked about marriage?" "Yes." "I told you no." "You did." He turned his eyes back to the ceiling. "My hands know how to manage the ranch while I'm down. You don't need to stay." "I know," Eleanor said. She picked up the newspaper again. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the night outside wind through the pines, distant sounds from the barn. After a while, Caleb said, "The gray horse, Storm. Is he—" "He's fine," Eleanor said without looking up from the paper. "Pete took him to the east pasture. He was spooked badly, but nothing broken. He'll settle by morning." Another silence. "Thank you," Caleb said. Eleanor turned a page she hadn't actually read. "Get some sleep."
"Son."
She was still there in the morning. And the morning after that. It was not, she told herself firmly, because she had nowhere else to be. She had a store to run, a debt, to think about a situation with Caldwell that was not going away. Those things were waiting for her. But Caleb had no one else, and the injury was serious enough that she'd already watched Pete try to make breakfast and nearly light the kitchen on fire, and Stokes was genuinely needed at the ranch work that couldn't stop just because the boss was laid up. So Eleanor stayed. She cooked. She managed the household. She sat with Caleb in the evenings when he was awake and alert enough to be irritable about being confined to bed, which she discovered was a very Caleb Wyatt way of being awake. Impatient, restless, deeply unhappy about being still. On the third evening he tried to get up and she pushed him back down with one firm hand on his shoulder and told him that if he tore those ribs loose, she was going to leave him there and let Pete handle breakfast. Caleb stared at her. "You're serious," he said. "Completely," Eleanor said. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved across his face and disappeared. "Bossy woman," he muttered. "Stubborn man," Eleanor replied and went back to the kitchen. On the fourth day, Victor Caldwell came to call. He arrived mid-morning with two men Eleanor didn't recognize and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He knocked on the door of the ranch house as though he owned it, which Eleanor reminded herself was probably exactly what he was planning. She opened the door before Pete could get to it. Caldwell's smile flickered when he saw her. He recovered quickly because men like Caldwell practiced recovering quickly. "Miss Carter," he said. "This is unexpected." "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Caleb isn't seeing visitors. He's recovering from a serious injury." "I'm aware of the accident," Caldwell said smoothly. "I came to offer my assistance. In difficult times, neighbors ought to support each other." "That's very kind," Eleanor said. "We're managing fine." Caldwell said. His tone remained pleasant. His eyes did not. "Yes," Eleanor said. Caldwell looked past her into the house. "I wonder if I might come in and pay my respects." "Now isn't a good time," Eleanor said. "I'll let Caleb know you came by." She closed the door. She stood on the other side of it with her heart hammering and her hands perfectly still at her sides, and she listened to the sound of Caldwell's boots on the porch steps until they faded. From the bedroom doorway, Caleb's voice came dry as dust. "He didn't believe you." Eleanor turned. Caleb was leaning against the doorframe in a way that suggested he'd been out of bed for longer than she'd given him permission to be. "No," she agreed. "He didn't." Caleb studied her. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm absolutely afraid of him," Eleanor said. "That's different from letting him see it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much time do you have left on that debt?" 11 weeks, Eleanor said. Caleb looked at the door. Then he looked at her. "My offer still stands," Eleanor said. "The legal arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less. Protect both properties. Deny Caldwell the creek access he needs to control the valley." The silence stretched. "You'd have your own room," Eleanor continued. "Your own life. I'm not asking for anything personal. I'm asking for a signature on a document and a presence in this valley that tells Caldwell he doesn't get to take what doesn't belong to him." Caleb said nothing for so long that Eleanor thought he was going to refuse again. Then he pushed away from the doorframe and walked carefully with the controlled movement of a man who was managing significant pain toward the kitchen table. He pulled out a chair. He sat down. "Sit," he said. Eleanor sat across from him. "If we do this," he said, "I have rules." "So do I," she said. "Tell me yours first," he said. "I run my store my own way. I handle my own accounts. I don't ask permission for my own decisions." She looked at him steadily. "And I don't lie, to you or anyone else. If we're doing this, we do it honestly." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Mine are the same." He paused. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not. I'm not a warm man. I don't talk much. I won't—" He stopped. "You won't fall in love with me," Eleanor said. "I understand. I'm not asking you to." Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't identify. "Right," he said. "Right," she echoed. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the morning light, two people who had no business trusting each other and were about to do it anyway. "We'll go to Briggs tomorrow," Caleb said. "Have him draw up whatever's needed." "He'll tell Caldwell," Eleanor said. "Let him," Caleb said. "That's the point." Eleanor nodded. Caleb put out his hand across the table. Not a warm gesture, not the kind meant to comfort. A direct one, the kind that meant I give you my word. Eleanor shook it. His grip was steady and solid, even injured, and his eyes stayed on hers the whole time. Don't thank me, he said. I wasn't going to, Eleanor said. That ghost of a smile again. And then it was gone, and they were back to the business of being two strangers who had just changed each other's lives without fully understanding what that meant. The ceremony took place on a Wednesday. It was not a church wedding. Neither of them wanted that it would have felt dishonest, and dishonesty had been the first rule both of them made. It was a legal proceeding in Judge Hartwell's office on Main Street, with Pete and old Hattie Moss as witnesses, because Eleanor liked Hattie, and Pete would have been hurt to be left out. Caleb wore his best shirt, which was cleaner than his work shirt, but still recognizably the shirt of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. He had trimmed his beard. Eleanor noticed that without meaning to. She wore a dove-gray dress that had belonged to her mother because it was the nicest thing she owned, and because she didn't think it would be honest to wear white. Judge Hartwell read the words. They said what was required. Caleb slid a ring on her finger, plain silver, clearly purchased at the last moment exactly the right size, which surprised her. Outside the window, Greystone Peak went about its business, and inside the judge's office, something became official that neither of them had expected to be true a week ago. Congratulations, Judge Hartwell said, with the mild warmth of a man who performed these proceedings regularly. You may. He paused, rethought something. Congratulations, he said again simply. Eleanor looked at her left hand. She looked at the man standing next to her, who was looking at the middle distance with an expression she still hadn't fully learned to read. Thank you, Caleb said to the judge. He turned toward the door. Caleb, Eleanor said quietly. He looked back at her. She didn't know what she meant to say. She wasn't sure anything needed to be said, but something in her felt the weight of the moment and didn't want it to pass completely unacknowledged. Thank you, she said. For this. He held her gaze. Don't thank me yet, he said. Caldwell's going to move fast when he hears. I know, she said. Are you ready for that? Eleanor picked up her gloves from the judge's desk. She put them on. She looked at Caleb Wyatt, this silent, difficult, unexpected man who had agreed to stand between her and the worst kind of trouble, for reasons she still wasn't entirely sure she understood. I've been ready, she said. She walked out first. He followed. Behind them, Greystone Peak was already starting to talk. The morning after the wedding, Eleanor woke up before dawn. Not because she was anxious, or not only because of that. She woke up because the ranch made sounds she wasn't used to yet. The horses moved in the barn. The wind came off the mountain in a way that was different from town lower and more constant like breathing. The floorboards of the house had their own language, and she hadn't learned it yet. She got up and made coffee. She was standing at the stove when Caleb came through from the back of the house, already dressed, already looking like a man who had been awake for an hour. He stopped when he saw her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he moved to the table and sat down, and she poured 2 cups without asking, and that was how the first morning of their marriage began, quietly, practically without ceremony or pretense. Caldwell will have heard by now, Caleb said. Yes, Eleanor said. She sat across from him with her own cup. Briggs would have told him last night. He'll come at the store first, Caleb said. Not here. He'll want to see if you're alone. I won't be alone, Eleanor said. I have work to do there. I'll take Pete. Caleb shook his head. Pete's needed at the ranch. Take Stokes. Stokes doesn't need to babysit me. He's not babysitting you, Caleb said without heat. He's making a statement. Caldwell reads presents. One of my men standing in your store says the ranch is behind you. That matters more than a legal document right now. Eleanor looked at him. She had not considered that angle, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. All right, she said. Stokes. Caleb nodded once and drank his coffee. Outside, the mountain morning went on without them, indifferent and enormous. "You sleep all right?" he asked. It came out a little stiffly, like a man who had remembered that common courtesy existed and was trying to apply it correctly. "Fine," she said. "You, well enough." A pause. "Ribs still pull. Doc says another 2 weeks before I can ride properly." "Then you won't ride improperly," Eleanor said. He looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite amusement, and was perhaps the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. "You always like this?" he asked. "Like what?" "Decisive." Eleanor set down her cup. "Is that a complaint?" "No," Caleb said. He looked out the window. "No, it isn't." Stokes was a man of 50 with a gray mustache and the deliberate economy of movement that came from decades of physical work. He said very little on the wagon ride to town, and Eleanor appreciated that. She had enough to think about without conversation. The store was smaller than she remembered from her first day in Greystone Peak, which was strange because she'd been inside it twice now, and it hadn't changed. But she looked at it differently today. It wasn't just her father's debt anymore. It was the thing she was fighting for. That made it feel more fragile and more real at the same time. She unlocked the front door, and Stokes positioned himself near the entrance without being told to, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. Not threatening, just present, just visible. The first 2 customers were women from town, Mrs. Hale, the doctor's wife, and a younger woman named Clara Webb, who ran the millinery next door. They came in for thread and ribbon and stayed for something else entirely, which Eleanor recognized immediately and decided to address directly. "Yes," she said, counting out Clara's change. "Caleb and I were married yesterday." Clara's eyes went wide. Mrs. Hale's expression did the complex thing that older women's expressions do when they are recalibrating an entire opinion very quickly. "Well," Mrs. Hale said. "It was a small ceremony," Eleanor continued pleasantly. "We didn't want to fuss." "Of course," Mrs. Hale said in the tone of a woman who intended to fuss about it extensively the moment she was back on the street. Clara leaned forward slightly. "Is it true that Caldwell—" "Here's your ribbon," Eleanor said. "That's 20 cents. Thank you so much for coming in." Clara took her ribbon. Both women left. Eleanor listened to the sound of their footsteps accelerating as they hit the boardwalk outside, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of private amusement before the door opened again. This time it was one of Caldwell's men. Not Caldwell himself, he would want her to feel the anticipation. But this man, broad-shouldered and wearing Caldwell's brand on his jacket, walked up to the counter and looked at Eleanor with the casual insolence of someone who had been sent to deliver a message and had decided to enjoy it. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mrs. Wyatt," Eleanor said. The man blinked. That small correction landed exactly where she meant it to. "Mr. Caldwell sends his congratulations," the man said, recovering, "and his continued interest in discussing the property matter." "That's kind of him," Eleanor said. "Tell Mr. Caldwell that property matters are handled by my husband and our attorney. He's welcome to contact Mr. Briggs at his convenience." The man's jaw tightened. "Mr. Caldwell prefers to handle things personally." "So do I," Eleanor said. "Good morning." From the doorway, Stokes cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough. The Caldwell man looked at him, looked back at Eleanor, made the calculation. He left. Eleanor straightened the items on the counter that didn't need straightening and told herself that her hands were not shaking. They were not shaking. She was perfectly fine. Stokes looked at her from the doorway. "You do that like you've been doing it your whole life," he said. "I have not," Eleanor said. "Didn't say it showed," Stokes said, and went back to watching the street. Caleb heard the report from Stokes that evening and said nothing for a full minute afterward. "She handled it herself," Stokes said. It was not a question. "Sounds like it," Caleb said. "Didn't flinch. Corrected the man on her name before he even got started." Stokes paused. She's something, that woman. She is, Caleb said. His voice gave nothing away. But after Stokes left, Caleb stood in the barn for a long time with his hand on Storm's neck. The gray stallion who had nearly killed him, who was entirely calm now, who pressed his nose against Caleb's shoulder in the way horses do when they are apologizing for something they don't fully understand. And he thought about a woman who was not his wife, not really, who had saved his life, and walked into his house and corrected a Caldwell man on her name without blinking. The woman he had turned away 3 days ago. He pressed his forehead against Storm's neck. Yeah, he said to no one in particular. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks in which the whole of Greystone Peak watched Caleb Wyatt's ranch, the way mountain people watch weather, constantly at an angle, never quite directly. Eleanor ran her store 6 days a week. She fixed 3 broken shelving units, renegotiated a supply contract with the grain merchant that saved her $11 a month, and repaired 7 dresses, 2 coats, and 1 very complicated riding skirt for women who had not previously given her their business, and were now doing so for reasons that were partly practical and partly the social recalibration that followed any dramatic shift in status. Married to Caleb Wyatt meant something in this valley. She was still learning the exact shape of what it meant, but she could feel the edges of it. At the ranch, she was less certain of her footing. The house itself, she managed easily enough. She had kept house since she was 12 years old, and the practical mechanics of cooking and cleaning required only adjustment, not learning. But Caleb himself was a different education entirely. He was not unfriendly, he was not warm. He was present in a way that was more like the mountain than like a man, constant, solid, not giving much, but not demanding much either. He said what he meant, and nothing extra. He did not make conversation for its own sake. He did not fill silence, because silence made him uncomfortable. Eleanor, who had grown up in a house with a talkative father and a bustling shop, found this initially strange, then gradually not strange. And then one morning, about 10 days in, she realized she had stopped waiting for him to speak and had started simply being in the same silence as him, and that the silence felt not comfortable exactly, but honest, like the difference between a room that's empty and a room that's being used. She was thinking about this at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening when Caleb came in from the barn and sat down with the account books he reviewed every week, and without looking up from them, he said, "You renegotiated the grain contract." Eleanor looked up from her sewing. "Heard about that, did you?" "Millard mentioned it when I went into town." A pause. "He wasn't happy about it. He was charging 30 cents above market rate," Eleanor said. "He was happier when I pointed that out than when I told him I had a price from the Denver supplier, but he agreed." Caleb turned a page in the account book. "You saved $11 a month." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, good. That was the end of it. He went back to his accounts. She went back to her sewing. Outside, the Colorado evening went dark, in the particular way it went dark at altitude, fast and full of stars. After a while, Eleanor said without looking up, "What's the state of the East Pasture water access?" Caleb set down his pen. He looked at her. "What do you know about East Pasture water access?" "I know that if the Bitter Pine Creek boundary remains disputed, you lose the ability to move the horses to higher ground in August without crossing Caldwell's surveyed land." She threaded a new needle. "Pete told me. He didn't mean to. He was talking about the summer rotation." Caleb was very still for a moment. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to everything," Eleanor said. "It's how I know things." Another silence. But this one was different, not the comfortable working silence of before, but something more alert. "The survey is contested," Caleb said finally. "Has been for 3 years. Caldwell had a man come out and restake the east boundary 6 months ago. I pulled the stakes. He put them back. I contacted the Territorial Land Office and they said they'd send someone out to review." He paused. "That was 4 months ago." "They haven't come," Eleanor said. "They haven't come." Eleanor set down her sewing. "I can write a letter," she said. "I can write letters very well. and I have a cousin in Denver who reads law." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You have a cousin who reads law," he said slowly. "Second cousin. He hasn't passed the bar yet, but he understands the processes, and he knows people who have." She met Caleb's eyes. "Let me write the letter." Caleb picked up his pen again. He looked at the account book. He said, "Write the letter." Eleanor picked up her sewing. Neither of them said anything else. But something had shifted in the room, small and definite, like a key turning in a lock that neither of them had acknowledged was locked. The first real trouble came on a Friday night 12 days after the wedding. Eleanor was closing up the store when she heard raised voices from the alley beside the building. She set down the lockbox and went to the back door and opened it and found 3 men she didn't recognize, crowding a 4th man into the corner. A young rancher named Davis, 22 years old, who ran a small outfit 3 miles east of town and had the particular look of someone who has been cornered by something much larger than himself. "Step away from him," Eleanor said. All 4 men looked at her. The 3 crowding men had the particular look of Caldwell-hired muscle, not local, not familiar, wearing new boots that told her they'd been recently outfitted. The leader of the 3 looked at Eleanor with an expression of genuine surprise that a woman had appeared in a doorway and issued an instruction. "Ma'am," he started. "I said step away," Eleanor said. "This is my property. You're in my alley. And what you're doing to that man is something I'd be very interested in describing to Sheriff Tatum tomorrow morning if you give me reason to." The leader looked at his companions. Something passed between them. Then Caleb's voice came from the far end of the alley. He had come around from the street side, and Eleanor didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but his voice was very quiet and very certain. "She asked you to move," he said. "I'm asking too. That's twice. There won't be a third." Caleb was not carrying a weapon visibly. He didn't need to. He was a very large man who was standing very still in the way that certain men stand still when they mean it, and the mathematics of the alley changed immediately. The 3 men left. Davis sagged against the wall. "They wanted me to sign something," he said, still shaking slightly. "Said I had a week to clear my eastern fence line, or they'd do it for me." "What's your eastern fence line adjacent to?" Eleanor asked. "Caldwell's western pasture," Davis said. Eleanor and Caleb looked at each other over the young man's head. "You'll stay at the ranch tonight," Caleb said to Davis. "Come on." Davis looked between them. This mismatched pair of a newly married couple, the woman in her store apron, and the man who had just unmoved 3 hired men by standing still, and he said, "Yes, sir." On the wagon back to the ranch, Eleanor sat between Caleb and Davis and thought about the eastern fence line and the survey stakes and the letters she needed to write and the $11 a month she'd saved and how all of it was connected and how Caldwell was moving faster than she'd expected. "He's not waiting for October," she said quietly, so only Caleb could hear. "No," Caleb said. "He's not." "Why now?" "We've only been married 12 days. "Because the marriage slowed him down but didn't stop him. He's trying to consolidate everything around us before the Territorial Land Office responds to your letter." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "So we need the letter to matter sooner." "We need more than a letter," Caleb said. He kept his eyes on the road. "We need evidence. Caldwell's been pulling survey stakes and pressuring small ranchers for 3 years. That's a pattern. Patterns can be documented." "Documented how?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Davis isn't the first man to be cornered in an alley," he said. "He won't be the last. But if we can get statements, names, dates, what was said from enough of them, that becomes a legal case," Eleanor said. "Not just a dispute." "Yes." Eleanor looked at the road ahead. The mountain dark was full of stars and very quiet. "I know most of the ranching families in the valley by now," she said. "They come to the store." Caleb glanced at her. "I can ask questions," Eleanor said. Casually. Women asking questions about community matters aren't threatening. Men don't guard themselves the way they do with... She paused. "With men." Caleb looked back at the road. "That's true," he said. Is that all right with you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he said, "I don't own you, Eleanor. You know that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking because we're partners in this. Not because I need permission." Another pause. Longer. "Then yes," he said. "It's all right with me." And then after a breath, "Be careful." It was a small thing to say. 2 words. But something in the way he said them, not a command, not a warning, just a plain statement of what he wanted, made Eleanor feel something she didn't entirely understand. "I will," she said. The twist came on a Tuesday afternoon, the 3rd week of their arrangement, when Eleanor was in the back room of the store going through her father's old files and found a document she had not been looking for. It was a letter, dated 14 months earlier, addressed to her father, written on Caldwell's personal letterhead. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the back room with the letter in her hands and read it a 3rd time. It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a contract one that her father had signed, a contract that gave Caldwell the right of first purchase on the Carter property in the event of the owner's death or financial insolvency at a price determined by Caldwell himself. Her father had signed this. Had signed it apparently in exchange for a loan extension that had kept the store running through a difficult winter. Had signed it without telling her. Had signed it and then died and left her to walk into this valley without knowing. Eleanor sat on the floor for a long time. She was not primarily angry at her father. She understood the desperation that made a man sign something like that. The cold of a mountain winter, the fear of losing everything, the gratitude for any lifeline. She understood it completely. But she was also underneath everything furiously sad, in the way that grief doubles back on itself, because her father had been protecting her by keeping this secret, and it had left her more exposed than anything. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the front of the store and waited on 3 customers with complete composure. And when the last one left, she locked the front door and told Stokes she was ready to go back to the ranch. She didn't tell him what she'd found. She told Caleb. That evening after dinner, after the lamps were lit and the ranch house had settled into its nighttime sounds, she put the letter on the kitchen table between them. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, the careful stillness that was his natural expression. The slight tightening around his jaw that she had learned in 3 weeks was the only visible sign of something landing hard. He set the letter down. "This changes things," he said. "I know. If this contract holds, the marriage doesn't protect the land the way we thought." He looked at her. "It protects you. The personal debt transfers, yes. But this first purchase clause, Caldwell's attorneys could argue that the marriage doesn't nullify a prior contract entered into by the previous owner," Eleanor finished. "Yes, I know." Caleb pushed back from the table. He stood up and paced the length of the kitchen, which was about 8 steps, and then he turned around and paced it back, and Eleanor watched him think the way you watch someone work without interrupting, without offering, just letting it happen. "Your cousin in Denver," he said. "The one who reads law." "I wrote to him last week," Eleanor said. "About the survey. I can write again." "Write tonight," Caleb said. "Send it express tomorrow. He needs to see this specific contract and tell us whether the timing of our marriage has any bearing on its enforceability." He paused. "It might. The contract was signed before you inherited. There's an argument that it can't bind an heir who had no knowledge." Eleanor looked at him. "How do you know that?" Caleb stopped pacing. "I had a land dispute 8 years ago," he said. "Different circumstances. But I spent 6 months learning more about territorial property law than I ever wanted to know." Something moved across his face, a memory, or the edge of one. "Ended up not needing it. But I remember." "What was the dispute?" He looked at her for a moment. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you write the letter." Eleanor recognized a door closing when she heard one. She didn't push it. "All right," she said. She wrote the letter that night at the kitchen table, while Caleb worked on his own accounts. The 2 of them bent over separate papers in the lamplight, and it was so ordinary and so strange at the same time that Eleanor had to stop twice and remind herself how she had come to be here in this house at this table with this man. The reminder felt less grounding than it used to. She wasn't sure what that meant. The thing about living with a person, even a person you have no romantic claim on, no personal history, with no mutual feeling for the thing, is that proximity is its own kind of intimacy. Eleanor learned Caleb's hours without trying to. She knew that he was up before 5, regardless of the weather. She knew he drank his coffee black and didn't eat much in the morning and was usually starving by noon. She knew that Storm was his favorite horse, in the way that certain men have favorite horses, not sentimental, just acknowledged, and that whenever something was troubling him, he went to the barn. She knew that he sometimes stood in the doorway of the house in the early evening and looked at the mountain to the north for long minutes at a time, not meditating, not calculating, just looking. She had asked him once what he was looking for, and he'd said, "Nothing, just looking." And she had decided that was probably true. She knew that he laughed almost never, but that when something genuinely struck him as funny, the laugh was sudden and real and briefly transformed his face into something much younger. She saw it happen exactly once in those first 3 weeks. Pete had tried to explain to Caleb why one of the fence posts in the south field had ended up in the creek, and the explanation had involved a goat, a rope, and a sequence of events that were both completely logical and entirely absurd. And Caleb had laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a real laugh, short and sharp, and Eleanor had been standing at the barn door watching, and she felt something move in her chest that she immediately decided to ignore. She was getting less successful at ignoring things. Abigail Monroe arrived in Greystone Peak on a Thursday morning 7 days before the drama in the South Pasture that would change everything. Eleanor didn't know who she was at first. She came into the store around 10 o'clock and looked at fabric, really looked with genuine interest and knowledge, and she was beautiful in the particular way of women who have learned how to make the most of what they have. And she was wearing city clothes in the way that people wear city clothes in mountain towns, which is to say she was wearing them as a statement. "You must be Eleanor Wyatt," the woman said, looking up from a bolt of blue silk. "I am," Eleanor said. "I'm Abigail Monroe." A brief pause and then, "Caleb and I were close. Before." Another pause, more deliberate. "A long time ago." Eleanor said nothing. She set down the bolt of muslin she'd been inventorying and looked at Abigail Monroe with the same direct attention she gave everything. Abigail was 34 or 35, Eleanor guessed. Brown hair, very dark. Eyes, a quality of beauty that had aged into something more composed than it had probably started as. She was watching Eleanor the way people watch someone to see if they know something. "It's nice to meet you," Eleanor said. "Are you back in town for long?" "That depends," Abigail said pleasantly. "On what?" Abigail set the silk down. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was almost kind. "I heard about your arrangement," she said. "I don't mean that as a criticism. I understand practical decisions, but I want to be honest with you because I think you seem like a woman who appreciates honesty." She met Eleanor's eyes. "I came back for Caleb." The store was very quiet for a moment. "I see," Eleanor said. "I made a mistake 10 years ago." Abigail continued. "I thought I wanted something different. I was wrong. And when I heard he was alone, I should have come sooner. I know that." Something in her voice wavered slightly genuinely. "But I heard he was married and I thought I needed to know. Before I made any assumptions." Eleanor looked at the woman in front of her, who was not performing this, who was simply saying something true in the way that made it land differently than a performance would. She thought about what she was supposed to say, about what was honest, about what was fair. "You should talk to Caleb," Eleanor said. Abigail blinked. "That's all you're going to say?" "What else should I say?" Eleanor said. "You're not asking for my permission, and I'm not in the habit of answering questions that are really meant for someone else." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, became more complicated. "He's very lucky," Abigail said quietly. "If it's real." Eleanor kept her eyes steady. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Abigail Monroe bought 2 yards of blue silk and left. Eleanor stood at the counter for 3 full minutes without moving. Then she turned back to her inventory and worked through the afternoon without stopping. She didn't tell Caleb that night. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She told herself it wasn't relevant to their arrangement. She told herself a number of things that were technically true, and together added up to something that wasn't. The right moment came the next evening when Caleb came in from the barn with the particular closed-down expression she had learned meant something had happened, and before she could say anything, he said, "Abigail Monroe is in town." Eleanor set down the pot she was holding. "I know," she said. She came to the store. Caleb went very still. "She talked to you?" "Yes." "What did she say?" Eleanor looked at him. This was the part she had been deciding how to handle for 24 hours. She decided, as she almost always decided, to say it directly. "She said she came back for you, that she made a mistake and she wants another chance." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Caleb," Eleanor said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is your life. Our arrangement has nothing to do with who you, it doesn't bind you that way. If she—" "Stop," he said. Eleanor stopped. He looked at her across the kitchen. His expression was doing the complicated thing that she had learned in 3 weeks happened when he was working through something that didn't resolve easily. "What did you say to her?" he asked. "I told her to talk to you." "That's all?" "That's all." Caleb looked at the wall. He looked at the window. He looked at Eleanor. "She hurt you," Eleanor said quietly. "A long time ago. You don't have to pretend that doesn't matter." "I know it matters," he said. His voice was very low. "That's not the question." "Then what is—" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched in that particular way. His silences stretched not empty, but full of something moving underneath. "The question," he said finally, "is whether what I had with her then is the same thing as what—" He stopped. Eleanor waited. He shook his head once barely. "I'll talk to her," he said. "I owe her that much. A conversation." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You do." He looked at her for a moment longer, and there was something in his expression that she didn't know how to read, something that was looking for something in her face, in the room somewhere, and not quite finding it, or perhaps finding something it hadn't been looking for. Then he said, "Good night, Eleanor," and went down the hall. Eleanor stood in the kitchen until she heard his door close. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and pressed them down hard and told herself very firmly and clearly that she had known from the first day what this was and what it wasn't. The problem was that her chest didn't believe her, and that she realized, sitting alone in the kitchen of a man who was not really her husband, in a valley that was trying to take everything she owned on a summer night that smelled of pine and distance and something she didn't have a name for yet, that was the most frightening thing that had happened to her since she arrived in Greystone Peak. More frightening than Caldwell. More frightening than the contract. More frightening than everything. Because Caldwell, she could fight. The contract, she could challenge. Legal arrangements could be navigated and documented and argued before a judge. But this thing that was growing in the kitchen of Caleb Wyatt's house, quiet and undeclared, and entirely inconvenient, this she had no strategy for at all. Caleb talked to Abigail on a Saturday morning. Eleanor knew because she was in the store when she saw them through the front window. Abigail standing on the boardwalk across the street, Caleb a few feet away, with his hat in his hands, which was the only time Eleanor had ever seen him hold his hat instead of wear it. It meant something, that gesture. She didn't know exactly what, but it meant something. She made herself look away and go back to the bolt of cotton she was measuring for Mrs. Pruitt, who was talking about her daughter's wedding, and didn't notice that Eleanor had measured the same yard twice. She didn't watch them. She told herself she was not watching them, and she kept telling herself that right up until Stokes came in for his mid-morning coffee and positioned himself at the window with the practiced casualness of a man who was absolutely watching them. "Stokes," Eleanor said. "Ma'am." "Don't." Stokes turned around with an expression of perfect innocence. "Just checking the weather," he said. "It's July," Eleanor said. "It's sunny. Drink your coffee." Stokes drank his coffee and said nothing else, which was worse than if he'd said something because it meant he was thinking loudly. When Caleb came into the store 20 minutes later, Eleanor was alone. She was behind the counter going through invoices, and she heard the door and didn't look up. "How'd it go?" she asked, because not asking would have been its own kind of statement. Caleb set his hat on the counter. He stood there for a moment. "I told her the truth," he said. Eleanor looked up then. His face was tired in a way that wasn't physical. "Which truth?" she asked carefully. "That I'm not the same man she left," he said. "That I don't think she's the same woman who left either, and that some things don't reassemble once they've come apart." He paused. She understood. I think she understood before she came here. I think she needed to hear it said. Eleanor held his gaze. "Are you all right?" He picked up his hat. "I'm fine," he said, and then quieter, like something he hadn't planned to say. "I thought it would feel different, seeing her." "How did it feel?" Caleb looked at the door. "Smaller," he said, "than I expected." He put his hat on and left. Eleanor stood at the counter for a long moment, with her hand pressed flat on the invoices she was no longer reading, and she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized after a moment as relief, and then felt immediately guilty for the relief, and then decided that guilt was a waste of time and went back to her invoices. But the relief stayed. The letter from Denver arrived on a Wednesday. Eleanor's second cousin Thomas was 26 years old and had the cheerful, aggressive intelligence of a young man who had recently discovered that the law was not a fixed thing, but a flexible one, and he had written 8 pages in a small, precise hand that covered every possible angle of the first purchase contract with the focus of someone who had stayed up all night to be useful. Eleanor read all 8 pages, standing at the kitchen table, while Caleb sat across from her. And when she finished, she went back to the beginning and read the important sections twice. And then she set the letter down and looked at Caleb. "He says the contract is challengeable," she said. "Maybe more than challengeable. The clause that Caldwell's arguing the first purchase right, it was entered into by my father under duress. Thomas found 2 territorial court precedents where contracts signed under financial coercion were set aside." Caleb leaned forward. "Duress has to be proven." "Yes, but Thomas also says..." Eleanor found the section pointed to it that the specific language of the contract may be self-defeating. Caldwell wrote it to give himself the right to determine purchase price. Thomas says there's a strong argument that's an unconscionable term under territorial law, which makes the entire contract voidable. Caleb read the section himself. He was quiet for a moment. "Voidable isn't voided," he said. "No, but it means we have standing to challenge it in court, properly, before a judge with legal representation." She paused. "Thomas wants to come. He says this is exactly the kind of case he's been..." She almost smiled. "He says it's the kind of case that establishes careers." "Young man looking for a fight," Caleb said. "Young man who knows the law," Eleanor said. "And who would work for costs rather than fees because I'm family and he believes in the case." Caleb looked at the letter again. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Send for him," he said. "Already wrote the reply this morning," Eleanor said. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "Of course you did," he said. "I told you I pay attention," Eleanor said. "You told me that 3 weeks ago," he said. "I believed you then too." The moment sat between them, uncomplicated and warm and slightly unexpected, the way the best moments usually are. Then Caleb said, "There's something else we need to talk about." Eleanor waited. "Davis came to me this morning," Caleb said. His voice went back to serious. "He's not the only one Caldwell's men approached. Harmon Fletcher out on the North Ridge, they went to his wife while he was away. Told her that her husband had debts that could be called in. His wife has been sick, Eleanor. They've got nothing left over. He paused. And old Garrett Sims Caldwell sent a man to offer to buy his water rights. Said if Garrett didn't sell, there might be trouble with the dam upstream. Eleanor's stomach tightened. The dam that feeds Sims's cattle. The same. Caldwell owns the dam upstream. He controls the company that does, Caleb said. Which is the same thing. Eleanor put both hands on the table. Caleb, this isn't just land consolidation. This is organized pressure across the entire valley. Fletcher Sims. Davis us. If he gets enough of these pieces, he doesn't just own land. He owns the water. He owns the access routes. He owns the leverage over every working ranch between here and the timberline. I know, Caleb said. We need more than Thomas, Eleanor said. We need statements. Documented signed statements from every rancher he's pressured. Fletcher's wife, Sims Davis, whoever else. Names, dates, exactly what was said, and by whom. That's asking these people to put their names on something that Caldwell will see as a declaration of war. Yes, Eleanor said. It is. Caleb was quiet. Will they do it? She asked. Caleb looked at his hands. Then he looked at Eleanor. Some of them will, he said. If someone asks right. If you ask, Eleanor said. He nodded slowly. If I ask? Then ask, Eleanor said. And I'll talk to the women. Fletcher's wife. Sims's daughter. She's the one who actually runs their accounts. The women in this valley know more about what's been happening than their husbands have told anyone. She held his eyes. Let me do this part. Caleb studied her for a long moment. You understand that once we start collecting those statements, Caldwell will know what we're doing within a week. I know. He'll move faster. Whatever he's planning, he'll accelerate it. I know that too, Eleanor said. But if we wait, he consolidates quietly, and then there's nothing left to challenge. At least if he moves fast, he makes mistakes. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that she had never quite seen before. Something that might have been the beginning of trust. Real trust. The kind that wasn't tactical or practical, but simply personal. All right, he said. We start tomorrow. They started tomorrow. Caleb rode north to Harmon Fletcher's ranch, while Eleanor drove herself to the Sims property in the wagon, and by the end of the week, they had 4 signed statements. Davis's, Sims's Fletcher's wife Margaret, and a rancher named Boyd, who had 3 children, and a lease on creek water that Caldwell had threatened to contest without ever specifying why. Boyd's statement was the most useful. He had dates. He had the name of the specific Caldwell man who had approached him. He had crucially kept a letter handwritten on plain paper unsigned, but in handwriting that 2 people who worked for Caldwell identified separately when Eleanor showed it to them casually in the store, and asked in her most conversational tone if they recognized the hand. They both said yes before they realized they'd said it. Eleanor wrote it all down. Everything. Carefully in the organized, systematic way that she had managed her father's accounts, and negotiated grain contracts, and repaired other people's clothes precisely without sentiment, with the plain confidence of someone who understood that paper lasted longer than memory. She brought the accumulated documents to the kitchen table one evening, and laid them out for Caleb, who read each one in order, and when he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "Do what?" "This." He gestured at the table, at the organized evidence of weeks of careful work. "Build a case out of conversations." Eleanor thought about it honestly. "My father's store," she said. "You learn fast which customers will pay and which won't, which suppliers keep their word and which are making promises they can't honor. You learn to read people." She paused. "And I had a lot to lose. That focuses the attention." Caleb looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the response to land. Then he looked back at the documents. "Thomas gets here next Friday," he said. "Yes. Caldwell's going to know before Friday," Caleb said. "He already knows something's happening. I could see it in his man's face when he came by the north fence this morning. Just watching. Not approaching, just measuring," Eleanor said. "Yes." Eleanor began stacking the documents into careful order. "Let him measure," she said. "We've been building something real. He's still trying to figure out what it is." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." She looked up. He was looking at her with that direct, unguarded look that was rarer than his smile and more startling when it came. "I want to say something." She waited. "When you came to me at the creek," he said slowly, "I thought you were asking me to solve your problem. I said no because—" He paused. "Because I've spent 15 years solving problems alone, and I believed that was the only way things got solved correctly." Eleanor said nothing. "I was wrong," he said. Flat and simple the way he said everything. Not about the plan. The plan was sound, but about the alone part. He looked at the table. "You've done more in 6 weeks to protect this valley than I did in 3 years of pulling survey stakes and writing unanswered letters." He met her eyes again. "I want you to know I see that." Eleanor sat very still. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a love confession. It was a man who did not give compliments telling her exactly what he saw without embellishment or strategy. It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she expected. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm just being accurate." "You say that every time," she said. "Because it's always true," he said. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the Colorado summer night was warm and dark, and full of the particular sounds of a mountain ranch at rest. Eleanor looked at the documents she'd stacked, and thought about the fact that she was no longer entirely sure she wanted Caldwell resolved just so she could leave. She thought about that carefully, and set it aside for later, because there were things that needed to happen before she had the luxury of understanding herself. The first fire started on a Thursday night. Not the main barn, not yet. It was the small equipment shed at the southeast corner of the property, which was far enough from the house that no one smelled it immediately. Stokes saw the light from his bunkhouse window and raised the alarm, and by the time Caleb and Pete and Eleanor were all outside, the shed was burning with the focused intensity of a fire that had been helped to start. Caleb had it out in 40 minutes with the bucket line they ran from the horse trough. Eleanor, in the middle of that line, passing buckets with the same focused efficiency. She gave everything her hair loose from its pins, and her dress soaked to the elbow. When it was done, she stood with the other blackened people in the pre-dawn dark, and looked at what was left, and Caleb crouched at the edge of the debris, and found what he was looking for. Almost immediately, the accelerant-soaked cloth, the deliberate origin point. He stood up. He looked at Eleanor. "Caldwell," she said. "Yes," he said. "He knows about Thomas," she said. "He knows we have the statements." "He can't prove the statements exist yet," Caleb said. "But he knows we're doing something, and he's done waiting." He looked at the shed. "This is a message." "What does the message say?" Pete asked. He was 19 and had ash on his face and was trying not to look frightened and not quite succeeding. "It says he can reach us here," Eleanor said, "any time he wants." "So, what do we do?" Pete asked. Eleanor and Caleb looked at each other across the smoking debris, the way they had started doing when a decision needed to be made, that quick, wordless consultation that had developed without either of them designing it. "We send Thomas's letter today," Eleanor said. "Not Friday. Today." "The statements," Caleb said. "Copy them and send the originals with the letter. To Thomas, yes, but also to the Territorial Land Office directly, and to the Federal Marshal's office in Denver." She looked at Caleb. "If Caldwell has been interfering with boundary surveys, as well as pressuring ranchers, that's a federal matter, not just territorial." Caleb was already nodding. "The dam upstream. If he's been threatening water access across county lines, that's also federal jurisdiction. We send everything today," Eleanor said, "before he moves again." "He'll know we've sent it," Caleb said. "Good," Eleanor said. "Let him know. If he knows we've sent it to federal authorities, burning sheds becomes a much more dangerous proposition for him." Stokes, who had been quietly listening, said, "He's not going to stop because it's dangerous. Men like Caldwell get dangerous when they're cornered." "Yes," Eleanor said. "They do. So we make sure we corner him in a courtroom and not out here." She looked at the men around her. "Are you with us?" Pete straightened up despite himself. Stokes looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eleanor with that look she was getting less able to look away from. "We're with you," he said. Yet, the second fire happened 4 days later. This time it was bigger. Eleanor was in town at the store when it started. She heard the bell. Someone had set the church bell, ringing the emergency signal, and she came out onto the boardwalk and saw the smoke rising from the direction of the ranch and felt her heart drop entirely out of her body. She was on the wagon before Stokes finished getting to his feet. She drove faster than she'd ever driven anything. She came over the ridge and saw the south stable burning a large structure, the one that housed 12 of Caleb's best horses, and saw people already fighting it. But what she saw first, before anything else, was Caleb. He was inside. She knew it because Pete was standing at the stable door screaming his name, and because Storm the gray stallion was rearing in the yard, having clearly been brought out already, and because every instinct in her body registered Caleb's absence from the visible scene as a fact before her mind had fully processed the evidence. She was off the wagon and running before it fully stopped. Pete grabbed her arm. "Mrs. Wyatt." "Where is he?" she said. "He went back in for the Henderson's mare," Pete said. His face was white. She was panicking wouldn't come out. He went back in, and the beam... Which side? What? Which side of the stable did the beam come down? Eleanor said fast and direct, the fear in her body completely overtaken by the part of her that acted first and fell apart later. "East side," Pete said. "North end." "The south end, then." Eleanor went through the stable door. The smoke was immediately disorienting, thick and low and hot in a way that was physical, that pushed against her, and she dropped low instinctively, the way her father had told her once years ago about fire, because the air was cleaner near the ground. She pulled her collar over her face. She moved fast and low toward the south end, and she called his name once loudly. "Here." His voice came from the third stall down, strained. Not panicked. Caleb was not a man who panicked, but strained. She found him in the smoke. He was down on one knee with a fallen crossbeam across his left shoulder, and the Henderson mare pressed terrified against the stall wall behind him, and he had wedged himself under the beam at the moment it fell to keep it from coming down fully, and he was holding it with the focused physical endurance of a man who had been holding it for several minutes and knew he couldn't hold it much longer. "Take the horse first," he said immediately when she reached him. "Get her out, then come back." "Don't be ridiculous," Eleanor said, and she got her shoulder under the beam next to his. "Eleanor." "Stop talking and push," she said. They pushed. Together. And the beam shifted not much, but enough for Caleb to get his feet under him and surge upward, and Eleanor threw her weight against it at the same moment, and it rolled to the side and crashed against the stall wall, and Caleb grabbed the mare's halter, and they got her moving, and the three of them came out of the stable at a near run. And then there was sunlight and air, and the sound of Pete shouting something Eleanor couldn't hear because the blood was too loud in her ears. Caleb got the horse to Pete, and then his legs went. Eleanor caught him not fully. She was not large enough to catch a man. Caleb's size fully, but she got under his arm and kept him from going all the way down, and they went to one knee together in the yard, both of them coughing in the clear air. Caleb's hand gripping her arm with a strength that would leave marks she wouldn't mind having. "I told you to get the horse first," he said between coughs. "I got the horse," she said. "And you?" He looked at her. His face was covered in ash, and there was blood at his temple from something, and he was looking at her with an expression that had come completely undone from its usual careful arrangement. Something raw and direct, and wholly uncalculated. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she said. "Eleanor." "Caleb." She met his eyes. "Don't." He stopped. He was still gripping her arm. She was still under his, the two of them still half down in the yard, with the stable burning behind them and the whole ranch watching. "You went in after me," he said. like he was still processing it, like it didn't fit any category he had for how things worked. "Of course I did," Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked the way he almost never let himself look at anything. And then something happened in his face that she had never seen before. Something that wasn't silence, and wasn't calculation, and wasn't the careful management of a man who had spent 15 years protecting himself from exactly this. "Ellie," he said, not Eleanor. The short name like something had slipped out without permission. Her breath caught. The sound of Pete calling them back from the edge of the yard broke it. Caleb straightened. She moved back. They stood up separately like two people who had simply been helping each other stay upright, which was true, and also not the whole truth. And Caleb put his hat, somehow still on his head, back into place. But he didn't let go of her arm. Not all the way. His hand moved down to her wrist, and he checked her pulse point the way her father used to check hers when she was sick as a child, just to verify that everything was still working. It was a completely practical gesture. It was also the most intimate thing he had ever done. Eleanor didn't pull away. Sheriff Tatum arrived within the hour. He was a man of 60 who had survived 3 decades in mountain law enforcement by being slower to conclusions than everyone around him and more tenacious once he reached one. He walked through the yard. He looked at the stable. He looked at the equipment shed that had already burned 4 days ago. He looked at Caleb, who had a 3-inch cut at his temple that Eleanor had cleaned and bandaged with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to do something practical while her hands were still shaking. "You got evidence," Tatum said. "I sent evidence to the federal marshal's office in Denver 3 days ago," Eleanor said. "Copies here." She had the copies. She had gone into the house and gotten them the moment Tatum arrived, because she had known he would come, and she had known what he would ask. Tatum looked at the documents. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Caleb. "You think Caldwell did this himself?" Tatum asked. "I think Caldwell ordered it," Caleb said. "Same as the shed. I think if you look at who was seen on the South Road last night, you'll find at least one of his hired men." "I'd need witnesses to that." "Talk to Boyd Harmon," Eleanor said. "He was coming back from the Fletcher place last night. He uses the South Road." She paused. "He's already given a statement about Caldwell's pressure tactics. He'll talk to you." Tatum looked at her steadily. "You put all this together yourself." "My husband and I put it together," Eleanor said. "Together." Beside her, Caleb said nothing, but she felt him stand, marginally straighter. Tatum nodded slowly. He folded the copies. "I'll go see Boyd," he said. "And I'll send a wire to Denver, see where that federal inquiry stands." He looked at Caleb. "You be careful tonight." "Always am," Caleb said. Tatum left. Stokes took Pete and the remaining hands to assess what could be salvaged from the stable. The yard gradually cleared until it was Eleanor and Caleb standing in the afternoon light with the smell of smoke settling into everything. "He's going to escalate," Caleb said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He knows Thomas is coming. He knows the statements went to Denver. He knows Tatum is involved now." Caleb looked at what remained of the stable. "He's losing his quiet moves. The next one won't be a shed or a stable." Eleanor breathed steadily. "What will it be?" Caleb looked at her, directly, without flinching away from what he was saying. "He'll come after one of us directly," he said. "Or he'll come after the store. Something that hits harder." Eleanor felt the cold of it. She held it and didn't let it take her voice. "Then we need Thomas here faster than Friday," she said. "And we need to be somewhere that Caldwell can't reach us alone." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You'll stay here, at the ranch. Not at the store, not until Thomas arrives, and the legal process is formally initiated." "The store?" "Stokes can watch the store. The inventory can wait a week." His voice was steady and certain. "You stay here." Eleanor looked at him. The careful man who made rules about keeping people out was telling her to stay. She understood the practical reasoning. She also understood that the practical reasoning was not all of it, and she decided she was done pretending not to understand things she understood. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Something moved through Caleb's expression. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to relief that felt more personal. "Good," he said. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Earlier," she said. "In the yard. You called me Ellie." He held her gaze. He didn't look away or dismiss it. "I know," he said. The afternoon held very still around them. "I don't mind it," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb looked at her for a long moment with that fully unguarded look that appeared so rarely and hit so hard when it did, and said nothing. But he nodded. Once. And his jaw was tight in the way it went tight when something landed somewhere important. He turned and walked toward the barn to check on Storm. Eleanor stood where she was and looked at the mountain to the north. The same mountain she had seen him look at so many evenings from the doorway. For the first time she understood why he looked at it. Not for answers. Not for calculation. Just to look at something enormous and true and permanent when everything around you was burning and shifting and refusing to resolve into anything simple. She looked at the mountain for a long time. Inside her chest, something she had been managing carefully for 6 weeks stopped being manageable. She didn't fight it. She just let it be there, quiet and real and entirely inconvenient, like the mountain itself, too large to move, too present to ignore. And then she went inside to start dinner, because there was food to make and work to do, and a man who would come in from the barn at dusk and sit down at the table and not say much, and she intended to be there when he did. Thomas Carter arrived on a Thursday 1 day early because Eleanor had sent a second letter after the stable fire that said simply, "Come now, don't wait, don't." He was 26 years old and looked younger with the kind of energy that made him seem like he was always slightly ahead of wherever he was standing. He arrived with 2 leather cases full of documents. A letter of introduction from a Denver attorney named Hargrove, who had passed the bar 12 years ago, and agreed to serve as official counsel, and an expression of focused, barely contained excitement that Eleanor found simultaneously reassuring and exhausting. He shook Caleb's hand at the door of the ranch house and said, "I've read everything you sent, all of it. Mr. Wyatt, I want you to know this is one of the clearest cases of coordinated land fraud I've seen in 3 years of studying territorial law." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "You've been studying for 3 years," he said. "How many cases have you seen?" Thomas blinked. "This is my first actual one," he said honestly. "But Hargrove has seen 40, and he agrees with me." Caleb looked at Eleanor. "He's the best I have," Eleanor said. "And he's right about the case." "I am right," Thomas said without defensiveness. "Let me show you." They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. Thomas laid out everything: the first purchase contract, the survey interference, the rancher statements, the water rights threat, the 2 fires, and he arranged it in a sequence that told a story, which was, he explained exactly what a judge needed, not individual incidents, a pattern, a deliberate, documented, provable pattern of a single actor systematically working to control an entire valley through fraud, intimidation, and destruction of property. "The federal angle is the strongest," Thomas said. "Interfering with a territorial land survey is a federal offense. We have Boyd Harmon's testimony that Caldwell's man explicitly threatened to falsify survey markers. We have the original stake positions that Caleb documented 3 years ago versus the current positions. That alone gets federal marshals involved." "They're already involved," Eleanor said. "I sent the initial package to Denver 4 days ago." Thomas looked at her with frank admiration. "You sent it before I got here." "I sent it before the second fire," Eleanor said. "I thought we might need the head start." Thomas turned to Caleb. "Your wife is remarkable," he said. Caleb looked at Eleanor with an expression that had become familiar enough that she recognized its edges now, that steady, direct look that said more than his words did. "I know," he said. Eleanor made herself look back at Thomas's documents. "How long before the federal marshal responds?" Caleb asked. "If the wire Tatum sent supports the package Eleanor sent, a week, maybe less. Federal land fraud cases move faster than territorial ones because the jurisdiction is cleaner." Thomas paused. "But Caldwell will have contacts in Denver too. Men like him always do. He may be able to slow the initial response. Then we can't wait for Denver to move first, Caleb said. We need to be in front of Judge Hartwell before Caldwell has time to counter. Thomas nodded. I want to file a petition to void the first purchase contract on Monday. The unconscionable terms argument is solid. If Hartwell agrees to hear it, and I think he will, it gets the property dispute into the official court record before Caldwell can use the contract as a legal weapon. And the rancher statements? Eleanor asked. Those go with the federal package. They're evidence of a pattern, not just one contract. Thomas looked at them both. I need one more thing, though. The most important thing. He paused. I need direct physical evidence that Caldwell ordered the fires. Not just that his men did it. Him. Personally. The table went quiet. That's harder, Caleb said. Much harder, Thomas agreed. His men won't talk. They're paid not to. But, he looked at Eleanor. You said you found the original letter in your father's files, the unsigned one in handwriting 2 people identified as Caldwell's. Yes, Eleanor said. I want to find more letters like it. Not necessarily about the fires, about anything. Threatening correspondence instructions to surveyors, directives to his hired men. Any of it with that handwriting. Thomas leaned forward. If I can establish a pattern of written instructions in the same hand, and then show the court 2 independent identifications of that hand as Caldwell's, it ties him to all of it, Eleanor finished. Every piece of it, Thomas said. In writing. Eleanor looked at Caleb. The families who've been threatened, some of them may have kept letters, the same way I found my father's. Fletcher's wife mentioned a note, Caleb said slowly. When I talked to her for the statement, she said one of Caldwell's men delivered a written notice about the debt. I assumed it was formal bank correspondence. It might not be, Eleanor said. I'll go to her tomorrow. Take Stokes, Caleb said immediately. I was going to, Eleanor said. Thomas looked between them and had the particular expression of a young man who was watching something that had nothing to do with land law and had the wisdom to say nothing about it. Margaret Fletcher was a woman of 45 who had survived a great deal without advertising the fact. She received Eleanor in her kitchen and offered coffee and said very little until Eleanor explained clearly and fully what they were building and what it could mean, not just for the Carter property, but for every ranch in the valley that Caldwell had his hands around. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she got up and went to the bedroom and came back with a small wooden box and put it on the table. I kept everything, Margaret said. Every piece of paper that came to this house from anyone connected to that man, because I knew someday someone was going to need to see it. Eleanor opened the box. There were 11 documents. Letters, notices, one short note on plain paper in a small, precise hand. Eleanor's heart was already moving fast when she unfolded the plain note and read it and stopped breathing for a moment. It was specific. It had Fletcher's name and the exact amount of his debt and the exact date by which Caldwell expected the land to be signed over. It had no letterhead. It had no signature. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the same hand as the unsigned letter in her father's files. Margaret, Eleanor said carefully, would you be willing to testify that this note was delivered to your home by one of Victor Caldwell's employees? I'd be willing to say a great deal more than that, Margaret said. I'd be willing to say that when the man delivered it, he told my husband that Mr. Caldwell sends his regards and expects an answer by Friday. And I'd be willing to say I watched my husband cry that night for the first time in 20 years of marriage because he thought he was going to lose everything his father built. She looked at Eleanor with steady, clear eyes. I've been waiting for someone to ask me, Mrs. Wyatt. I was afraid no one was going to. Eleanor reached across the table and covered Margaret's hand with her own. Someone's asking, she said. She brought the box back to the ranch that evening and put it on the kitchen table and told Caleb and Thomas what Margaret had said, and Thomas took one look at the note and made a sound that was somewhere between satisfaction and barely controlled triumph. This is it, he said. This right here. Same hand, new witness, specific threatening language. This is the piece I needed. He looked at Eleanor. "How did you know to ask about written correspondence?" "Because Margaret is the kind of woman who keeps things," Eleanor said. "I recognized her from the store. She keeps every receipt, every letter, every notice. Women who've lived through hard times learn to keep paper. It's the only record they have when someone tells them something different happened than what did." Thomas nodded. He was already writing. "I'm filing Monday at 8, he said. "Hartwell opens early. I want to be there before Caldwell's attorney gets the news." "You think Caldwell knows?" Caleb asked. "He'll know by Sunday night at the latest," Thomas said. "In a town this size, everything moves by Sunday night." He was wrong about the timing, as it turned out. Caldwell knew by Saturday morning. They found out because the second piece of escalation came Saturday afternoon. Caleb was checking the north fence line when 3 of Caldwell's men found him. He was alone, which had not been wise, and which he acknowledged later without needing Eleanor to say it. He had ridden out alone because he needed to think, and because the north fence was something he could assess without requiring anyone else, and because there were moments when Caleb Wyatt still operated on the 15-year habit of doing everything alone. He heard them coming and turned, and they were already close. Not hired hands this time, not the labor muscle Caldwell usually sent. These were different men. Harder. The kind that got paid for a specific kind of work. The leader pulled up and looked down at Caleb from the saddle. "Wyatt," the man said, "Mr. Caldwell wants to make you one last offer. Personal and direct. You drop whatever your wife and her cousin are cooking up in that courtroom, you sign the creek boundary over to Caldwell's survey line, and Caldwell forgives the Fletcher and Sims debts outright. Walk away clean." Caleb stood at the fence. "And if I don't?" The man smiled the way men smile when they have already decided what comes next. "Mr. Caldwell said to tell you that accidents happen to people who don't pay attention. On mountain roads. At night." Caleb looked at the 3 of them. He kept his voice absolutely level. "Tell Caldwell that the answer is no. And tell him that this conversation just became a sworn statement." The smile went away. "That's so. There are 2 witnesses on this property right now," Caleb said. It was not true. He was alone. But the man didn't know that, and Caleb had spent 15 years reading which risks were worth taking. "I'd think about that before you say anything else." The 3 men looked at each other. The calculation ran across their faces. They left. Caleb stood at the north fence for a long minute. His hands were steady. His heart was not. He rode back to the ranch at a pace that was not quite a gallop and was not quite calm, and he came into the kitchen where Eleanor and Thomas were still working, and Thomas looked up and immediately looked back down at his papers, because something in Caleb's face was not for company. Eleanor looked up and stood up. "What happened?" she said. Caleb told her. All of it precise and sequential the way he told things. He watched Eleanor's face while he talked, watched the fear come and get managed and come back again, and watched her make herself breathe through it. When he finished, she said, "They threatened you directly, by name." "Yes, that's desperate," Thomas said from his corner of the table, unable to stay out of it. "Men like Caldwell don't send personal threats unless they're out of options. He knows the filing is coming. He's trying to stop it the only way he has left." "He's not out of options yet," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite. She had them pressed against the table. "He still has allies in the land office. He still has leverage over at least 2 county officials that I know of. He can delay the federal response if he knows the right people to contact." "He does know them," Thomas said. "That's why Monday matters. Once it's in front of Hartwell in an official proceeding, Caldwell can't make it disappear quietly." Caleb looked at Eleanor. "Can Thomas get Hartwell to hear it Saturday today?" Thomas looked up sharply. "Today is late afternoon. Hartwell won't—" "Emergency petition," Eleanor said fast. "Imminent threat to property and personal safety. We have the stable fire evidence, the shed fire evidence, and now a direct verbal threat to Caleb's person." She looked at Thomas. "Is there a legal mechanism for emergency court protection?" Thomas was already on his feet. "Yes," he said. "An emergency injunction, if Hartwell will hear it." He looked at the clock on the wall. He lives 4 miles out of town. If I ride now—" "Take Pete," Caleb said. "And take the Margaret Fletcher documents. Everything." Thomas grabbed his case. He was out the door in 2 minutes. Eleanor turned to Caleb. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the particular stillness of a man who has been holding something together under pressure for a long time and is starting to feel the edges of it. "Sit down," Eleanor said. Not a command. Something gentler than that. He sat. She poured coffee without asking the way she had that first morning and set it in front of him. Then she sat across the table and looked at him directly. "Are you all right?" she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Caleb." He looked at her. Then something in his shoulders shifted very slightly downward. "It's not the threat," he said. "I've had threats before. It's—" He stopped. "Tell me," Eleanor said. He looked at his coffee. "They mentioned the road. Mountain Road at night." He paused. "You come back from town on that road every time you go in." Eleanor was very still. "They weren't threatening just me," Caleb said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "They were letting me know they could reach you." The kitchen was absolutely silent for a moment. Eleanor felt the cold of it move through her. She sat with it and didn't look away from it, because looking away from real dangers had never once made them smaller. Then she said, "Then I don't go to town alone until this is resolved." "No," Caleb agreed. "You don't. And you don't ride the fence lines alone." He looked at her. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the coffee going cold between them, and Eleanor understood something in that moment about what the last 8 weeks had actually been. Not a legal arrangement, not a practical solution, not two strangers making the best of a bad situation, but two people who had stopped being strangers somewhere along the way, and hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened, the way you don't notice the moment the light changes in the mountains. You only notice that it's different now, and you can't remember it being otherwise. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens Monday," she said, "whatever Hartwell decides, whatever Denver sends, whatever Caldwell does next, I want you to know something." He waited. "I came here for a practical reason," she said. "I came here to save a piece of land. And I don't regret that. But it's not why I'm still here." She held his eyes. "I'm still here because this is where I want to be. Not because of the land. Because of—" She stopped. Then quietly, "Because of you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Caleb looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing the thing they did when something was landing somewhere deep past the layers of careful self-management he'd built over 15 years. Then he said, "Eleanor." "You don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I wanted you to know." "I know you're not asking," he said. "That's not why I'm saying it." He looked at the table, then back at her. "The practical arrangement was my idea," he said. "I'm aware of the irony of what I'm about to say." Eleanor waited. "I stopped being in a practical arrangement about 3 weeks in," he said. "Somewhere around the time you told me I couldn't ride him properly." The ghost of a smile there and gone. "I told myself it was gratitude, that you'd saved my life, and I was confusing that with something else." He paused. "I'm not confused anymore." Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest so completely that it was almost painful. "You're not," she said. "No," he said, flat and certain the way he said all the true things. "I'm not." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way she had covered Margaret Fletcher's hand 2 days ago. A gesture of plain, uncomplicated intention, and Eleanor turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything else for a while because some things didn't need more words than what had already been said. Judge Hartwell agreed to hear the emergency petition. Thomas came back at 8 o'clock that evening with the news and the judge's signature on a temporary restraining order prohibiting Caldwell or his agents from approaching within 500 yards of the Wyatt Ranch, the Carter store, or any property belonging to the ranchers who had submitted statements. It was not a final ruling. It was not a conviction. But it was a legal wall, and it had Hartwell's signature on it, and it meant that anything Caldwell did next would be done in direct contempt of court. Thomas put the order on the kitchen table and looked at them both and said, "Monday morning we finish this." Caleb nodded. Eleanor said, "What time?" 8 o'clock, Thomas said. "Hargrove arrives on the morning stage. We go in together." He looked at Eleanor. "You should be there. The court needs to see you. The property is yours. You are the plaintiff." "I'll be there," Eleanor said. Thomas looked between Eleanor and Caleb with that expression again, the one he'd been cultivating since he arrived, the expression of a young man who understood that he was peripheral to something larger than the case he'd come to argue, and said goodnight, and went to the bunkhouse where Stokes had set him up a room. The ranch house went quiet. Caleb poured 2 glasses of water. A deeply mundane thing. A thing so ordinary it almost broke Eleanor's heart, and set one in front of her and sat across the table. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. Neither of them moved. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." "When this is over." She stopped. "When the case is resolved and the land is secure and there's no more Caldwell to fight this arrangement we have." She looked at him directly. "I don't want to renegotiate it." He looked at her. "I want to keep it," she said. "All of it, not the legal arrangement, the actual one. The one where you come in from the barn at dusk, and I'm in the kitchen, and we sit at this table, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we don't." She paused. "I want that to be real. Properly real. Not a document." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's already real." "I know," she said. "I want us to both say so." He looked at her with that fully unguarded expression that appeared so rarely and moved through her so completely when it did. And then he said, "Then I'm saying so." Eleanor breathed. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and dark, and completely indifferent to the 2 people sitting at a kitchen table inside a mountain ranch house, choosing each other plainly and without theater. The way real things get chosen, not in dramatic moments of passion, but in the quiet aftermath of difficulty, when you know exactly what you'd lose if you lost it, and you decide deliberately that you won't. Sunday passed in a state of suspension. Thomas prepared. Caleb checked every fence and gate and latch on the property with the methodical attention of a man who was not nervous, but was being very thorough. Eleanor wrote 3 letters, one to Hargrove confirming their readiness, one to Margaret Fletcher telling her to come to court Monday if she was willing, one to Thomas's Denver contact at the federal marshal's office, detailing the direct verbal threat Caldwell's men had made at the north fence. At 6 o'clock Sunday evening, a rider came to the ranch with a message. Caleb took it at the door. He read it. His face did nothing visible. He brought it inside and put it on the table in front of Eleanor. It was from Victor Caldwell. Handwritten this time not in the careful, controlled script of his business correspondence, but something more urgent than that. A man writing fast. It said, "Drop the petition. Leave the valley. I will pay double the assessed value of the Carter property and forgive every debt connected to it. This is my final offer." Wyatt knows what refusal means. Eleanor read it twice. Then she looked at Caleb. "He's terrified," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "This letter is evidence," she said. "Yes," Caleb said again, and picked it up and put it with the others. "He's just handed us his own handwriting, his own words, and an implied threat in a single document." He set it down. "Thomas will want this tonight." "Thomas will be very happy tonight," Eleanor said. Caleb almost smiled. "He will." Eleanor looked at the letter one more time, at Caldwell's handwriting fast, and pressured the writing of a man who had spent years controlling everything around him and was feeling that control slip for the first time. She thought about her father, about the winter when he'd signed a contract he shouldn't have signed because he was desperate and cold and afraid, and there was no one to help him. She thought about Margaret Fletcher and her wooden box of kept papers, and her husband who had cried for the first time in 20 years. She thought about Davis and Boyd and Sims and Fletcher and all the other people who had been quietly squeezed and threatened and hadn't known they could push back. She thought about a man who had turned her away at a creek bank and then let her in anyway slowly without fanfare, in the way that real things happen. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Caleb said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers again. Not the checking gesture this time, not the pulse point assessment of a man making sure she was still standing. Just his hand on hers. Plain and deliberate and certain. Eleanor turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that until the lamp burned low and the mountain outside went fully dark, and there was nothing left to do but wait for morning, which was coming, regardless, the way morning always did in the mountains. Slow at first, then all at once, filling everything with light before you were entirely ready for it. Monday morning came, the way Caleb had said it would, slow at first, then all at once. Eleanor was dressed before 5. She heard Caleb in the kitchen before that, the sound of the coffee pot, the creak of his boots on the floorboards she had learned in her weeks at the ranch, the way you learn a language by living inside it. She came out, and he looked at her and said nothing, and she looked at him and said nothing, and they drank their coffee in the particular silence that had become somewhere along the way the most honest form of communication either of them had. Thomas came in from the bunkhouse at 6:30 with the leather cases and the expression of a man who had been awake for several hours and had used every one of them productively. He put the cases on the table and reviewed the sequence of presentation one more time, talking fast, and Caleb and Eleanor listened and asked the questions that needed asking, and by 7:15 they were ready. At the door, Caleb stopped. He looked at Eleanor in a way that she had learned by now was him saying something before he said it in words. "Whatever happens in there," he said. "I know," she said. "I mean it." "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "I know." He put his hat on and opened the door. They rode into Greystone Peak together, the three of them with Stokes behind and Pete alongside, and the morning was clear and cold the way Colorado mornings were even in summer at altitude, and Eleanor kept her back straight and her eyes forward, and felt the weight of everything that had led to this morning, like something she was carrying openly now instead of hiding, which was different and better and still heavy. Hargrove met them outside the courthouse. He was 58 years old and had the manner of a man who had won and lost enough cases to have stopped being afraid of either outcome, which Eleanor found immediately calming. He shook hands with everyone, reviewed the documents Thomas handed him in under 4 minutes, and said, "Good. This is very good. The Caldwell letter alone would be sufficient, but with the Fletcher correspondence and the survey interference evidence, we have something airtight." He looked at Eleanor. "You collected most of this." "We collected it," Eleanor said. Hargrove looked at Caleb. "You have a remarkable wife, Mr. Wyatt." "I know it," Caleb said. Hargrove straightened his jacket. "Then let's go use what she built." Judge Hartwell's courtroom was not large. It seated perhaps 50 people in the public gallery, and by 8 o'clock, that gallery was full. Eleanor had not expected that. She had expected a legal proceeding, formal, procedural, witnessed by the parties directly involved. She had not expected what she found when she walked through the courthouse doors, Davis and his wife sitting in the second row. The Fletchers. Margaret with her hands folded and her chin up. Boyd Harmon with 2 of his neighbors. Old Garrett Sims, who moved slowly but had come. A dozen other families from the valley whose faces Eleanor recognized from the store, from the road, from weeks of careful conversations over counters and through wagon windows. They had come because word had moved through the valley the way word always moved in small mountain communities, not through announcement, but through the particular quiet network of people who watch and wait and share what they know with the people they trust. Eleanor stopped walking when she saw them. Caleb put his hand at the small of her back, not pushing, just present. "They came," she said quietly. "They've been waiting for someone to give them a reason to," he said just as quietly. "You gave them one." Eleanor breathed. She moved forward. Caldwell was already seated at the opposing table with 2 attorneys Eleanor didn't recognize. Denver men, clearly expensive and composed, in the way of men who charged by the hour, and had no stake in the outcome beyond the professional. Caldwell himself sat between them, with an expression of contained, dangerous calm. He looked at Eleanor when she entered. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away first, and the moment lasted exactly long enough to establish something. And then Eleanor sat down and turned to face the judge's bench. Hartwell came in at 8 sharp. He was a methodical man, and a fair one, which Eleanor had determined in the weeks prior by asking questions of people who had appeared in his court. He adjusted his papers and looked at the room with the expression of a man who already had a sense of what was in front of him and intended to take it seriously. "We're here on an emergency petition filed by counsel for Eleanor Wyatt née Carter, requesting the voidance of a contract dated 14 months prior," Hartwell said, "and a preliminary injunction against Victor Caldwell pending investigation of property interference claims. Counsel, you may proceed." Hargrove stood. He was methodical and precise and utterly without theater, which was exactly right. He laid out the case the way Thomas had arranged it: the contract, the legal argument for voidance, the survey interference, the rancher statements, the fires, the direct verbal threat, and finally, Caldwell's own Sunday evening letter. He presented each piece in order and let the pattern speak for itself, which it did loudly and clearly, the way a well-built argument did, when it didn't need to be decorated. Caldwell's Denver attorneys objected 3 times in the first 20 minutes. Hartwell sustained 1 objection and overruled 2, which told Eleanor that the judge was being scrupulously fair, which was all they needed him to be. Then Caldwell's lead attorney stood to present the opposition. His argument was competent. Eleanor gave him that. He challenged the duress claim on the first purchase contract, arguing that a voluntary signature constituted informed consent regardless of financial circumstances. He challenged the survey interference evidence as incomplete and questioned the chain of custody on the rancher statements. He was organized and confident and made several points that Eleanor could see landing with the judge as worthy of consideration. She kept her face still throughout. She had learned over 8 weeks of Caleb Wyatt how to keep her face still. Then Hartwell said, "I'd like to hear directly from Mrs. Wyatt regarding the discovery of the original contract." Eleanor stood. She stated her name. She described finding the contract in her father's files when, where, in what condition. She described the letter from Caldwell's hand that she had found alongside it. She described showing the handwriting to 2 individuals independently, without context and their identification of it. She kept her voice level, and her sentences short, and her facts precise, and when Caldwell's attorney cross-examined her, she answered every question directly and without elaboration, which was the most effective possible strategy against an attorney who was hoping she would add something he could use. He did not get anything he could use. When she sat down, Caleb was looking at her in the particular way she had stopped trying to look away from. "Well done," he said very quietly. "I told you I pay attention," she said. The ghost of a smile. "Even here. Even now." The first twist came at 10 o'clock when Hartwell called a brief recess and a man Eleanor had never seen before came through the side door of the courtroom and handed a document to Hargrove. Hargrove read it. His expression did not change, which told Eleanor the news was either very good or he was a better actor than he appeared. He crossed to where Eleanor and Caleb sat and placed the document in front of them. It was a federal authorization, signed by the Marshal's office in Denver. It confirmed the opening of a formal federal investigation into Victor Caldwell for interference with territorial land surveys. A federal crime, and it named 4 specific incidents, 3 of which appeared in the package Eleanor had sent, and 1 that the Marshal's office had apparently found independently through their own channels. Thomas made a sound behind her that was entirely unprofessional and completely understandable. Eleanor read the document twice. Then she passed it to Caleb, who read it once and put it flat on the table with his hand on top of it like something secured. "When did this happen?" Eleanor asked Hargrove. "Filed Friday," Hargrove said. "Someone in the Marshal's office moved faster than I expected." He paused. "Someone with a strong initial package to work from." Eleanor looked at the document under Caleb's hand. 4 days ago, she had been standing in the yard watching the stable burn. 3 days ago, she had been sitting across from Thomas covering a kitchen table with evidence. 2 days ago, Caldwell's men had threatened Caleb at the north fence, and Caldwell himself had written a letter that was now in a court record. One day ago, she and Caleb had sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and said the things that needed saying. The world moved fast when it moved. "What does this mean for the hearing?" she asked. "It means the judge now knows that what's in front of him today has federal dimensions," Hargrove said, "which means he will be very careful about appearing to obstruct a federal inquiry by ruling in Caldwell's favor without ironclad justification." He paused. "It means our position just became significantly stronger." Caleb looked at Eleanor. She looked at Caleb. Neither of them said anything. The look was enough. Hartwell came back from recess. He had clearly been informed about the federal document during the break. His expression was, if possible, even more careful than before. Caldwell's attorneys requested a continuance more time to respond to the new federal element. Hartwell denied it. He said with the measured precision of a man who had made his decision and was stating it clearly, "The federal inquiry is separate from this court's jurisdiction. This proceeding concerns a contractual dispute and a petition for injunction, and I have sufficient evidence before me to rule on both today." Caldwell's lead attorney started to speak. Hartwell said, "Sit down, counselor." He sat. The courtroom went very quiet. Hartwell took 4 minutes to review his notes, which felt to everyone present like 40. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and told herself to breathe, which was advice she usually gave other people and was finding harder to take herself. Caleb's hand found hers under the table. She held it without looking at him. "Regarding the petition to void the first purchase contract," Hartwell said, "the court finds that the specific language of the price determination clause giving one party unilateral authority to set the purchase price constitutes an unconscionable term under applicable territorial law. This finding alone is sufficient to void the contract in its entirety. The contract is voided." From the gallery, a sound. Not an eruption. These were mountain people, not given to eruptions, but a collective exhale, a shift. The sound of a room full of people who had been holding their breath, letting it go at once. Eleanor felt something release in her chest so completely that her eyes stung, and she refused absolutely to let that happen here in this room in front of Victor Caldwell. She blinked once. She held Caleb's hand tighter. "Regarding the petition for injunction," Hartwell continued, "the court finds sufficient documented evidence of coordinated intimidation and property interference to warrant a permanent injunction against Victor Caldwell. His agents and his employees approaching, contacting, or engaging in any business, dealing with any of the named plaintiffs without prior court approval. Violation of this injunction will be treated as contempt." He looked directly at Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, are you and your counsel clear on the terms of this order?" One of the Denver attorneys answered for him. "Clear, Your Honor." Caldwell said nothing. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who was recalculating something very fast and not finding any of the numbers working in his favor. "The court also notes," Hartwell said in a tone that was quiet and carried anyway, "that the pattern of conduct documented in this proceeding will be forwarded to the federal marshal's office as supporting evidence for their ongoing inquiry." He set down his papers. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down, and the room came alive. Eleanor stood up slowly. Around her, the gallery was moving people standing, talking, crossing toward each other. She heard Davis's voice somewhere behind her, relieved and loud. She heard Margaret Fletcher say something she couldn't make out. She heard Thomas saying something to Hargrove that involved the word precedent 3 times in succession. She stood in the middle of all of it and felt the particular quietness that sometimes descends in the center of significant moments when the thing you have been moving toward for a long time finally arrives, and the arrival is so real that it needs a moment to be believed. Caleb was standing beside her. She looked at him. His expression was open in the way it was rarely open in company, unguarded, unmanaged, simply present. He was looking at her with everything he usually kept at a careful distance, and he was not looking away. "It's over," she said. "The legal part," he said. She understood what he meant. "Yes," she said. "The legal part." He reached up and touched her face. A brief, plain gesture, the back of 2 fingers against her cheek, and Eleanor felt it everywhere the way small true things hit harder than large dramatic ones. "Come on," he said. "People want to talk to you." She almost laughed. "They want to talk to us." "They want to thank you," he said. "I'm just the man who owned the fence line." "You are not just the man who owned the fence line," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "Not anymore." They stayed at the courthouse for 2 hours. That was how long it took. The conversations, the handshakes, the moments of plain human relief that people needed to express to someone after months or years of being afraid and not knowing how to stop being afraid. Davis shook Caleb's hand for a long time and couldn't quite find the words, and didn't need to. Margaret Fletcher embraced Eleanor and said against her hair, "Your father would have been so proud of you." And Eleanor held on for a moment longer than she'd planned, because that particular sentence required it. Old Garrett Sims found Caleb near the door and put one hand on his shoulder and said, "Your father was a good man. You're a better one." Caleb said nothing. His jaw was tight. He nodded once, and Sims nodded back, and that was all that needed to happen. Thomas found Eleanor near the end and said, "Hargrove thinks the federal case will close within 6 months. Caldwell will almost certainly be required to sell off the properties he acquired through fraudulent means." He paused. "Some of those ranchers may be able to buy back land they lost." Eleanor looked at him. "All of them." "Not all," Thomas said honestly, "but some. And the ones who can't, the injunction and the federal case together means Caldwell can't use that land as leverage against them anymore. He's finished in this valley." Eleanor nodded. She looked at the courtroom one more time, at the empty judge's bench, the cleared tables, the room returning to its ordinary state, the way rooms do after extraordinary things have happened in them, as though the walls themselves had agreed not to mark it. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "You did everything I asked you to do, and more." Thomas straightened slightly. "You built the case," he said. "I just argued it." "We both know that's not entirely true," Eleanor said. He smiled, a genuine one without the professional overlay. "Let me know when you need a lawyer again," he said. "I have a feeling you'll do something interesting with that store." "I have a feeling you're right," Eleanor said. He left to catch the afternoon stage. Eleanor watched him go and felt affection for him that was entirely uncomplicated, the way you felt for people who had shown up exactly when they were needed and done exactly what was required. Then she turned around and found Caleb behind her, waiting, his hat in his hands, in the way she'd first seen through the store window. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked out of the courthouse into the Colorado morning together. The second twist came that afternoon, and Eleanor almost missed it because she was not looking for it anymore. They were back at the ranch, the relief of the morning settling into the particular bone-deep tiredness that follows sustained high tension, when Sheriff Tatum rode in at 2 o'clock with a look on his face that was not what Eleanor had expected from a man whose town had just had its primary villain legally cornered. He dismounted and asked to speak with Caleb privately. Eleanor said, "Whatever you need to say to my husband, you can say to me." Tatum looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "She stays." Tatum nodded. He took off his hat. "Victor Caldwell left town this morning," he said. "Before the hearing started. His men were seen loading wagons at the Caldwell property at 5:30. He was gone before Hartwell called the room to order." Eleanor stared at him. "He left before the ruling." "Yes, ma'am." "He knew," Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. "He knew what was coming." "We think so," Tatum said. "Someone in the courthouse, a clerk maybe, or someone with access to Hartwell's initial review of the petition, tipped him off that the ruling wasn't going in his favor." He paused. "He took what he could load in 4 wagons, and he left." "The federal warrant," Eleanor said. "If he crosses state lines." "The Denver Marshal's office has already been notified," Tatum said. "He won't go far. Men like Caldwell can't go far. They need their networks, their contacts. He'll surface somewhere within the month." He paused. "But he's gone from here. Permanently, I'd say. He's not coming back to a valley that just filed federal charges against him." Eleanor sat down on the porch step because her legs had made that decision independently. Caleb crouched beside her. "You all right?" She stopped. Thought about what she was. "Relieved," she said, "and angry that he got to leave before the gavel came down." "He still loses everything," Caleb said. "The federal case follows him. The injunction follows him. The land he acquired through fraud that doesn't stay his." He paused. "He doesn't get away, Eleanor. He just doesn't get to stand in that room and hear it." Eleanor looked at him. "I wanted him to hear it," she said. "I know," Caleb said. Tatum said gently. "A man like that hears it eventually. Just not always where you expect." Eleanor breathed. She looked at Tatum. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything you did. The wire to Denver, being willing to hear what we brought you." Tatum put his hat back on. "You brought me something real," he said. "That's all I needed." He looked at Caleb. "Your father would have liked her." He mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Caleb stayed crouched beside Eleanor on the porch step. He was looking at nothing in particular, processing in the quiet way he processed things. Eleanor watched the side of his face and thought about what Tatum had said, and thought about a man she had never known who had apparently built something worth inheriting, not just the land, but the disposition toward it, the stubbornness and the honor, and the particular way of being present without requiring anything in return. "Tell me about your father," she said. Caleb looked at her. It was not a question he had expected. "Sometime," she said quickly. "Not now if you don't want to. She paused. "I want to know the things about you that I don't know yet. There are a lot of them. I want to have time to learn them." He looked at her for a moment. The afternoon light was on his face, and he was not managing his expression at all. "There's time," he said. "Yes," she said. "There is." He sat down on the step beside her, which brought him close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them moved away, and that was all that needed to happen right then. 3 weeks later, the federal marshals found Victor Caldwell in Santa Fe. Thomas wrote to tell Eleanor with the particular energized precision of a young man who was finding out that the law was exactly as interesting as he'd hoped. The federal charges were formal and specific. The proceedings would take time. Federal cases always did, but Hargrove believed the outcome was not genuinely in doubt. The evidence was too clean. The pattern was too documented. The witnesses were too numerous and too credible. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked out the window at the August morning and felt something she recognized after a moment as peace. Not the temporary relief of a crisis resolved, but something deeper and more permanent. The particular peace of knowing that the right thing had been done in the right way, and that the people who had been ground down by the wrong thing now had their names on a federal record that said this happened and it was wrong. And someone with authority finally agreed. She was still looking out the window when Caleb came in from the barn. He saw the letter. He saw her face. He sat down across the table without asking. "Santa Fe," she said. "They found him." "Good," Caleb said. "Thomas thinks the case is solid." "Thomas is right," Caleb said. He had come to this conclusion about Thomas 3 weeks ago and stated it without ceremony, which was its own form of high compliment from a man who didn't offer compliments casually. Eleanor folded the letter. "The store," she said. "I've been thinking about the store." "Tell me," Caleb said. "The dressmaking side of it isn't enough on its own," she said. "It never was. My father ran it as a general dry goods which covered the gaps. But I've been looking at the accounts, and I think there's room to expand the textile side significantly. The women in this valley have no source for quality fabric within 40 miles. If I stocked properly and opened a small alterations workshop in the back..." She stopped. "I'm talking about reinvesting most of what the land is worth in a business expansion." "I know," Caleb said. "You don't mind." He looked at her with the expression she had learned was his version of genuine amusement, not a smile exactly, but the light behind his eyes that meant something landed. "Eleanor," he said, "I have never once minded anything you decided about your store." "It becomes our store," she said. If we're doing this properly, then it becomes our store, he said, and I've never minded anything about it. She looked at him for a moment. You're remarkably easy about this for a man who spent 15 years doing everything alone. I spent 15 years doing everything alone, he said. I know what that's worth. He held her eyes. Less than this. Eleanor felt the warmth of it move through her, quiet and sure and completely real. There's something else, she said. He waited. Margaret Fletcher mentioned that her husband has been thinking about whether to rebuild the east barn, the one Caldwell's men damaged last year before any of this started. Eleanor paused. He doesn't have the lumber. But your north timber stand, you said last month you were planning to clear the southern section anyway. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You want me to give Fletcher the timber? I want you to tell me what you think about giving Fletcher the timber, Eleanor said carefully, the ghost of a smile. You already know what I think. I know what I hope you think, she said. Then you're right, he said. Tell Fletcher to send his boys up with a wagon. We'll spend a Saturday. Eleanor nodded. She filed it away in the part of her mind that kept track of things that needed doing alongside the store accounts, and the letter to Thomas, and the grain order for September, and a dozen other items that were simply the ongoing substance of a life being built and maintained. It was a good list. It was the best kind of list. Not a list of crises to survive, but things to accomplish quietly and steadily, because you were not afraid of the future anymore. The anniversary came in September. 1 year since the day they had stood in Judge Hartwell's office with Pete and Hattie Moss as witnesses, and said what was required, and meant very little of it, and meant some of it more than they knew. Eleanor had not expected Caleb to mark it. He was not by nature or habit a man who marked dates. She had fully prepared herself to let the day pass without mention. She came into the kitchen that morning and found a small box on the table. Plain wood, no ribbon. Very Caleb. She opened it. Inside was a ring, not plain silver this time. A narrow gold band with a small inset stone, deep blue, the color of the Colorado sky in late summer, the color of the mountains in the hour before dark. Someone had made it carefully. Someone had thought about it. She looked at it for a long moment. Caleb came in from outside and stopped when he saw her face. Too much, he said. Eleanor looked up at him. Her throat was tight, and she did not intend to cry, but she was deciding between that and laughing, and both felt equally true. No, she said. Not too much. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. He picked up the ring from the box. The first time I put a ring on your hand, he said, it was to solve a problem. I know, she said. This one is different, he said. He looked at her steadily, the way he said all the things that mattered directly, without flinching, without decoration. This one is because you are the best thing that has happened to me in 15 years, maybe longer. He paused. And because I am a man who doesn't say things unless he means them, so when I say I love you, I need you to know I have thought about it carefully, and I mean it entirely. Eleanor felt the full weight of it land exactly as he'd intended. Not softened, not managed, not held at the careful distance he had given everything for 15 years. Simply the truth offered plainly by a man who had earned the right to mean it. She put out her left hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. The blue stone caught the morning light and held it. I love you too, Eleanor said. I have for a long time. I just kept finding practical reasons not to say it. I know, he said. I watched you do it. She looked up sharply. You watched me. You get a very specific expression, he said. When you're about to say something true and deciding not to, your chin goes up slightly. Eleanor opened her mouth and closed it again. How long have you known? Since the stable fire, he said. You came in after me. That wasn't practical. No, she agreed. It wasn't. He looked at her with the fully unguarded expression that had become in a year the thing she looked forward to most in any given day, that direct, uncalculated look from a man who had spent 15 years not letting anyone close enough to see it. You could have told me sooner, she said. You could have told me sooner, he said. She laughed. Actually laughed short and real, the way his laughs were sudden and genuine and briefly transforming. She felt it move through her chest and warm everything it touched. "All right," she said. "We're equally foolish." "Equally," he agreed, and the ghost smile was a real one this time, complete, unhidden, the face of a man who had stopped managing himself into smallness. He reached up and touched her face the way he had in the courtroom, the back of 2 fingers against her cheek. And then he didn't take his hand away. He left it there, warm and certain and present. Eleanor leaned into it, outside the Colorado. September was turning the mountain aspens gold. Inside the ranch house kitchen, Pete was going to arrive in an hour and want breakfast, and Stokes had a fence report, and there was grain to order and a letter to write to Thomas, and the store opened at 9. All of it was waiting. All of it was real. All of it was theirs. But for this moment, Eleanor stood in the kitchen of the ranch she had come to as a stranger and stayed in as something entirely different. And she held the hand of the man who had turned her away at a creek bank, and then spent a year proving that the most important decisions a person makes are the ones they change their mind about. And she understood with the plain and total certainty of a thing that has always been true, that this was not the ending of anything. This was what a beginning looked like after everything it had taken to get here. A gold ring, a blue stone, a man who said what he meant. A mountain out the window that had been there before either of them, and would be there after, enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small, enormous fact of 2 people choosing each other inside a kitchen on a Tuesday morning in September. They had built this, not found it. Built it from paper and legal arguments and bucket lines and letters and kitchen table silences and the particular trust that only comes from surviving something real together. And it was theirs. Completely, permanently, undeniably theirs. That was enough. That was in fact everything.